Name is Chloe Northrup. Oh dear, let me mute my computer. Okay, is that better? All right, so I'm Chloe Northrup. I'm the department chair for the history department here at Connect Campus, and we're so excited that you joined us today for this talk by Dr. Scott Langston from Indian boarding schools that we're hosting here at the Tahita Fulkerson Library at the Trinity River campus. And we've had some really dynamic programming for this throughout the month of February. And we're just so excited that you're joining us either here physically or if you're streaming with us today. We welcome you. And please feel free to put in the chat any questions that you might have for the question and answers. And if you're here in person, please enjoy some of the delicious pizza and cookies and drinks that we have in the bag. And definitely make sure to check in for that extra credit, both online and in person. So today, Dr. Scott Langston has been closely involved in Texas Christian University's Native American and Indigenous Peoples Initiative since its inception in 2015 and continues to serve since 2020 as the university's inaugural Native American Nations and Communities Liaison. He has recently retired after a career of 30 years teaching at various institutions, including nearly 20 years at TCU in religious studies and American history. He has worked with a number of Native American communities and groups in Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska, including the Wichita and affiliated tribes, Alabama Coshawta tribes of Texas, Chickasaw Nations, Indigenous Institutes of the Americas, American Indian Heritage Day in Texas, and MMIW Texas Rematriate. And we hosted one of the leaders of that last week in our panel. In 2022, TCU awarded him its Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Award for his work with Native American and Indigenous communities. In 2023, TCU's Race and Reconciliation Initiative made him the co-recipient of its Plume Award for his work in establishing and sustaining TCU's Native American and Indigenous Peoples Initiative. Langston is past president of the Southern Jewish Historical Society, current board member of the Texas Jewish Historical Society, and current editor for the primary sources section of the journal Southern Jewish History. In 2017, Southern Jewish Historical Society awarded him the Samuel Proctor Award for Outstanding Career Scholarship in Southern Jewish History. Let us welcome Dr. Langston here today.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here and humbled to be here to talk with you, but especially to talk with you about this topic. It's a really important topic, but it's also a sacred topic. It's not just an academic topic. These are sacred experiences of Native peoples and communities, and I want to treat this topic with that kind of sacredness rather than just another academic topic for that. I should tell you, though, that I am not Native American. For that matter, I'm not Jewish. You might have thought that from my background, neither one of those. I'm just a white guy, and I was born here in Fort Worth, but then grew up in Southeast Texas in what was a small town. It's not small anymore. Houston's about to gobble it up. I grew up in Conroe, Texas, but when I grew up there, Houston was a long way away and Conroe was very small. So extraordinarily conservative environment that I grew up in, conservative religiously, politically, and in all ways. Nobody back then in my hometown would have ever guessed that I would be standing in front of you today and talking to you about Native American boarding schools. It's been a long journey for me to get to this point. I'm fortunately have had many Native people who have graciously taught me, and I have learned from them and listened and still have much to learn from them. And the whole reason why I begin this topic with this introduction of myself is because Native peoples have taught me that I need to position myself in relationship to the topic that I'm about to speak on. So you have to take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt, because I'm not speaking as a Native person or a member of a Native community who has experienced this. I'm rather speaking as a non-Native, a white person. If you want to use the terms colonizer, that's where I come from. That was the history of my family. You know, most of my family were poor people. They weren't powerful people, but they sure benefited from the policies that powerful people put in place that hurt Native American peoples. So that's the background that I come from, that I'm going to be speaking from. I want to begin our topic with just a few session acknowledgments. You know, sometimes you want to give a land acknowledgement. I'm not going to give a formal land acknowledgement, but just some points to kind of put in context some of the remarks that we'll be talking about and considering. One thing is that Native Americans are sovereign nations. This is very important. This is really what sets Native Americans apart from every other group within the United States. They're first and foremost a national or political entity rather than a race or a culture. There are racial and cultural aspects, but first and foremost, they are nations who are sovereign and who are in a government-to-government relationship with the United States. The United States Constitution, Supreme Court, other courts, have all recognized this. These are sovereign nations. In addition to that, Native peoples have been here a lot longer than non-Native peoples of any group, thousands of years. And in fact, as we've gathered today, I'm very mindful that just a few blocks from here, I think it was on the corner of Lexington and Weatherford streets, a few years ago, there was a construction progress, and they uncovered remains of an indigenous woman who it was determined she was in her 30s. And the date was approximately, I think, 790 to 990 AD or CE, over 1,000 years ago. Indigenous peoples were here, at least over 1,000 years ago. We're the newcomers to the place. And so I think that is important to shape the way that we think about what we are doing. We are currently located on the lands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes. So that's the Wichita, the Waco, the Keechai, the Tawakoni tribes. These were their homelands. So before Europeans, before Americans came here, Wichita and affiliated tribes were here, and they are still in existence. Their government still exists. They were forcibly removed from Texas. They're headquartered in Oklahoma now, but they are still here. We are on their lands. I was born in Fort Worth. But really, I think maybe what I should say is that I was born on the Wichita and affiliated tribal homelands, because that's what it was before it was Fort Worth. So we want to respect them. Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex was founded on an exterminating war against Native Americans carried out by the Republic of Texas. Now that's a hard statement to hear. And I want to say, before we get very far into this, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is hard to hear. From a non-Native perspective, it's tough to hear. It can be challenging. It's easy to become defensive, but these are realities. From a Native perspective, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is painful, and I apologize for that, and I want to try to handle that very sensitively. But the bottom line is, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex began as a result of the Republic of Texas carrying out, and I'm using the words of President Maribel B. Lamar, he called it an exterminating war against all the Native peoples of Texas. He mentioned he inaugurated that in late 1838, and then over the next several years he attempted to carry that out, and the Republic of Texas carried it out beyond him. But were it not for that exterminating warfare, Dallas-Fort Worth would not have originated. And in fact, where it hits even closer to home is that on May the 24th, 1841, General Edward H. Tarrant, for whom